Nia Roberts stood tall in the courtroom, her eyes focused on Judge Charles Hawkins, who sat at the bench with his stern expression as he examined the papers in front of him. Nia could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on her, but she remained calm. The rest of the room seemed to fade away. As she tried to make her case, she was used to being underestimated, but this time it felt different. The judge's gaze was cold and different, as if he already knew her fate. She had done everything right. The property she had renovated was a historic building, one that had seen better days, but Nia had a vision. She had seen potential in it, where others had only seen decay. But now she was here fighting for it. The fine she was facing was substantial and could set her project back months or even years. She couldn't afford that, not after all the work she had put into it, not after all the people she had promised to help by revitalizing this neighborhood. Nia had built her business from the ground up. She wasn't born into wealth or privilege. She had worked tirelessly to overcome every obstacle that came her way. But there was something about the way Judge Hawkins looked at her that stung the most. It was as if he saw her not for what she had accomplished, but for the color of her skin and her gender, as if those things alone made her less deserving of his respect, less deserving of the benefit of the doubt. She tried to explain to him the intricacies of the renovation, how the zoning issue was a small misunderstanding, one that had been blown out of proportion, but his eyes remained fixed on the paperwork in front of him, and he barely acknowledged her words. Nia had known judges like him before, the ones who assumed that people like her didn't have the knowledge or resources to navigate the legal system, the ones who thought they could simply hand down a ruling without ever understanding the bigger picture. The courtroom was quiet except for the sound of his pen scratching across the paper. Judge Hawkins didn't look up as he handed down his decision. The fine would stand, and Nia would be required to pay it in full. The words echoed in her ears as she stood there in shock. For a moment she had expected a fair hearing. She had expected to be heard, but instead she had been dismissed. She took a deep breath and nodded, thanking the judge before turning to leave. But as she walked out of the courtroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had been wronged. It wasn't just about the fine. It was about the way she had been treated. It was about the assumptions made about her. The moment she stepped into the room, Nia knew that she couldn't let this slide. This wasn't just about a legal battle. It was about standing up for everything she had worked for, everything she had built. And she wasn't about to let one judge take that away from her. Nia Roberts' journey had never been easy, but it had always been driven by purpose and determination. Born in a working-class neighborhood, she knew from an early age that nothing would be handed to her. Her mother, a nurse, worked long hours, and her father, a mechanic, often spoke of the value of hard work, but it was clear that their financial struggles were a constant presence in their lives. From a young age, Nia realized she wanted more than what was offered to her, and despite the obstacles she faced, she was determined to make a life for herself that was different. Her fascination with real estate started in high school when she worked part-time at a local library. She spent her free time reading about the history of the city, about its neighborhoods, and the potential they held for change. There were entire blocks of buildings left to rot, buildings that had seen better days but still held a certain charm. Nia saw what others couldn't. She saw opportunity. It wasn't just about making money. It was about revitalizing spaces and giving back to the community that had shaped her. The idea of transforming rundown properties into affordable housing for families like hers became her dream. When she graduated from college, Nia didn't have the luxury of family money or connections to rely on. She started small, purchasing distressed properties with loans and scraping together every penny she could. Every renovation was a battle, every setback a lesson. There were times when it felt like her dream would collapse beneath the weight of debt, but she refused to give in. Slowly, the properties she touched began to transform, and so did the neighborhoods around them. With each project, her reputation grew, and soon Nia became a name people recognized, not just for her business acumen, but for the way she approached urban development with heart and vision. But despite all of her success, Nia never stopped feeling like she was constantly fighting an uphill battle. Her skin color and gender seemed to be barriers she had to face every day. In boardrooms, people often underestimated her, doubted her abilities, or simply ignored her. In meetings with contractors, developers, or city officials, she had learned to speak louder, stand taller, and prove herself. It was exhausting, but it was necessary. She had made it this far because she refused to let those barriers define her. Her latest project, the historic building she had been working on for months, was one of the most ambitious she had ever taken on. The building was a former theater that had sat vacant for years, its once grand architecture faded beneath layers of dust and neglect. But to Nia, it was beautiful. She could see the potential in the cracked walls and chipped paint. She could envision it restored to its former glory, a place that would provide affordable housing for artists and young professionals eager to be part of the city's revival. But the zoning issue had thrown a wrench into everything. It was a minor infraction, one that could easily be corrected, but it had become a point of contention in the courtroom, and now she was facing a significant fine. As she sat in the courtroom listening to the judge's verdict, a feeling of frustration rose in her chest. She had put so much into this project, and now this judge, with his dismissive attitude, was threatening to halt everything. But this wasn't just about money. It was about proving to herself and to everyone who had ever doubted her that she was not to be underestimated. Nia wasn't backing down. She would fight this not just for the building, but for everything she had worked for. Judge Charles Hawkins had built his career on being a man of principles. With over 30 years on the bench, he prided himself on dispensing justice with a steady hand. His colleagues respected him, and his reputation for fairness was well established within legal circles. But there was a side to him that only a few saw: his discontent, the undercurrent of frustration that had been growing for years. He had long been accustomed to the power that came with his position, but lately it felt hollow. The cases he heard, the rulings he made, all seemed to blend into one monotony, a repetition of rules and procedures that no longer inspired him. Hawkins was nearing retirement, and the thought of what came next lingered heavily on his mind. He had worked his entire life to achieve his position, but now, at the tail end of his career, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to life than just the courtroom. His personal life was another source of unrest. He had always been an intensely private man, someone who kept his emotions and thoughts hidden behind the walls of his high-rise apartment. He had never married, never sought companionship beyond his work. His apartment, located in one of the city's oldest and most prestigious buildings, was his sanctuary, or at least it had once been. The building he called home was a majestic relic of a bygone era, but time had taken its toll. The marble floors were chipped, the walls cracked in places, and the once grand chandeliers no longer sparkled. Judge Hawkins had ignored the building's condition for years, too absorbed in his career to notice the wear and tear. But recently, things had changed. He found himself irritated by the creaks of the floors, the drafts that slipped through the old windows, and the constant maintenance calls that seemed to pile up. It wasn't just the building's physical state that bothered him, though. It was what it represented: the decay of his own life, the passage of time that couldn't be ignored any longer. To add to his discomfort, he had begun to resent the growing gentrification around him. As the city evolved, new buildings popped up, shiny and modern, while this building remained a symbol of a past he wasn't sure he could still relate to. He had become a spectator, watching as younger, more ambitious developers and entrepreneurs transformed the city. He often found himself on his balcony at night, gazing down at the bustling streets below, wondering if he had made the right choices. The ambition he had once felt seemed to fade, replaced by a quiet resignation. The turning point came when he received a notice from his building's management company. They were planning another round of repairs, and the cost would be significant. He groaned at the thought of yet another round of patching up the old structure. It was becoming clear to him that he could no longer ignore the building's condition, and he could no longer ignore his own dissatisfaction with his life. The constant upkeep and increasing fees felt like a weight on his shoulders, one that only seemed to grow heavier with each passing year. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the very building he lived in was about to become part of something much larger than he could ever have imagined. A discovery was coming that would force Judge Hawkins to reconsider everything he thought he knew about the world and about the people in it. The building's history, its faded elegance, was about to collide with the reality of Nia Roberts' vision, and in the process, Hawkins' carefully curated life would begin to unravel. The days following the court ruling were filled with tension for Nia. She refused to let the fine deter her, though the weight of it pressed on her mind. As the owner of a growing real estate empire, she had learned to handle setbacks, but this felt different. It wasn't just the financial burden, it was the principle. Judge Hawkins' ruling had been dismissive, and worse, it had felt personal. She had worked too hard to build her reputation as a serious businesswoman in an industry where people often underestimated her. This fine wasn't just an obstacle, it was a reminder of the biases she had fought against her entire life. Still, Nia wasn't one to back down from a challenge. Her legal team quickly moved to file an appeal, but the wheels of the legal system turned slowly, and the process was grueling. In the meantime, Nia dove deeper into her work. Her office, a sleek modern space high above the city's skyline, was a testament to her success. Yet, it had never been about luxury for her. It was about purpose, creating spaces that helped transform communities, offering affordable housing in the face of rising property prices, and breathing new life into forgotten neighborhoods. She spent long hours managing the operations of her latest developments, each one carefully designed to bring a sense of dignity and opportunity to underserved areas. The building at the heart of the zoning dispute, an old theater she had converted into an artist loft complex, was a project she was especially proud of. The work had been challenging. There were constant issues with contractors, delays, and unexpected costs, but Nia remained focused on the end goal. This building wasn't just another property, it was a symbol of her vision for the future. As Nia walked through the building one afternoon, she met with a group of young artists who had just moved in. Their excitement was infectious as they showed off their studios, each space transformed from the theater's old dressing rooms and rehearsal halls into vibrant creative spaces. Nia smiled as she listened to their stories, how the affordable rent had allowed them to focus on their art without worrying about exorbitant living costs. It was moments like these that kept her going. This was why she did what she did, to provide opportunities and to reshape the urban landscape in a way that benefited everyone, not just the wealthy. But even with this success, the fine from Judge Hawkins still lingered in the back of her mind. She knew that the case would be dragged out for months, but she couldn't afford to let it distract her. She had bigger plans. The city was changing rapidly, and Nia knew she had to stay ahead of the curve. In addition to her current projects, she was already scouting new properties, securing deals on underdeveloped plots of land where she could build even more affordable housing and community centers. Despite the overwhelming nature of it all, Nia thrived in the chaos. She found peace in the rhythm of her work, in the knowledge that with every building she restored, every community she helped, she was making a difference. She couldn't help but think about Judge Hawkins again, his cold gaze from the courtroom still fresh in her mind. She knew that this fight wasn't just about zoning laws or legal technicalities. It was about changing the way people like him saw people like her. And she wasn't going to stop until she had done just that. In the meantime, she stayed in touch with her lawyer, urging them to speed up the appeal process. The legal system might be slow, but Nia Roberts was never one to give up without a fight. A few weeks after the courtroom incident, Nia received a phone call that changed the course of her day. Her assistant Tina had left a message. Asterisk, the management company for that historic building downtown wants to meet with you. Asterisk, Nia's curiosity piqued. She knew this building, had even walked past it many times, admiring its grandeur despite its neglected condition. It was one of the oldest structures in the city, a towering piece of history, but it had fallen into disrepair over the years. The building had long been a symbol of the city's faded past, but Nia had always seen its potential. She agreed to meet with the management company, intrigued by the sudden interest. As she entered the lobby of the building that afternoon, Nia was struck by its beauty, despite its decay. The high ceilings, once decorated with intricate moldings, now stood chipped and faded, the floors worn from years of traffic. The grand staircase, though cracked, still exuded an elegance that seemed to whisper of its former splendor. But it was clear the building had suffered years of neglect, and it would take considerable work to bring it back to its former glory. Nia was escorted to a small office by the manager, who seemed eager to discuss plans for renovation. As they sat down, she couldn't help but notice the strange feeling of familiarity. The office was on the building's upper floor, overlooking a street lined with cafes and art galleries. It wasn't until she glanced at the floor plan hanging on the wall that something clicked. There, in the layout of the building, was a small notation that made her pause. The property was listed as belonging to one of her holdings. Her breath caught in her throat. Asterisk, wait a minute. I own this building, asterisk. Her mind raced, processing the information. This was the building Judge Hawkins lived in, the same one where she had just been fined. The realization hit her like a jolt of electricity. The fine she had been slapped with wasn't just a bureaucratic hassle. The very judge who had ruled against her, dismissing her arguments in court, was living in a building she owned. A mix of disbelief and irony flooded over her. The man who had passed judgment on her, who had questioned her knowledge and business practices, was one of her tenants. Nia couldn't help but smile to herself, though the feeling was far from victorious. It was more complex than that. She knew she had to confront this, not just for her own peace of mind, but for the larger principle at stake. As she continued to look over the documents in front of her, the manager spoke of the ongoing repairs the building needed and how difficult it was to find someone who could take on such a monumental task. Nia, still processing the shocking revelation, nodded thoughtfully. She was already considering how she could revitalize this building, how it could fit perfectly into her mission to restore and preserve the city's history while offering affordable living spaces. The fact that it was already part of her portfolio was serendipitous. But what had drawn her into this meeting was not just the building's potential. It was the quiet, mounting realization that Judge Hawkins had been living in her building, a man who had never known who truly owned the property, a man who had once dismissed her as just another businesswoman. The irony felt almost too much to bear, but it also gave her a sense of power she hadn't anticipated. As she left the building that day, Nia couldn't help but feel that fate had placed her on a path towards something larger. Judge Hawkins might have dismissed her in court, but now she held the key of something far more significant. The next move, she realized, would be hers to make. She had the power to shape not just the future of the building, but also the way people saw her. And as she walked away from the building, Nia knew that things were about to change for both of them. Nia couldn't stop thinking about the moment she discovered that Judge Hawkins lived in one of her buildings. It felt like a twist of fate, a plotline too strange for fiction. The more she thought about it, the more she realized the power dynamics at play. The man who had dismissed her, who had made her feel small and insignificant in that courtroom, was not just an anonymous figure behind the bench. He was someone she could reach, someone she could confront, someone who had unknowingly tied himself to her life and her success. It was a connection that, while unintentional on his part, could not be ignored. But Nia wasn't someone to be driven by revenge or bitterness. She was strategic, and this new piece of information gave her an unexpected advantage. If Judge Hawkins had been living in her building all this time, he had no idea the woman he had ruled against was, in fact, his landlord. That realization could shake his carefully constructed world, especially if she played her cards right. She decided to take action, but not in the way people might expect. Nia wasn't interested in petty retaliation. She wanted to make a point, not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever been underestimated or belittled by a system that so often tilted in favor of the powerful. It was about bringing attention to the wider issues of inequality and discrimination, of the invisible battles that women and minorities often had to fight just to be heard. But more than that, it was about making Judge Hawkins confront the person he had so casually dismissed. With the help of her legal team, Nia began to quietly gather information. She already knew the building's history and had a clear understanding of its condition. But now she needed to learn more about the judge, his habits, his daily routine, his interests. She wasn't interested in prying into his personal life for the sake of gossip, but rather to gain insight into how she could address him directly. Her goal wasn't to create a scandal or tarnish his reputation. It was about giving him a chance to see her as more than just the woman he had ruled against, a chance to force him to reckon with his own assumptions. Nia decided that the best way to do this was through the building itself. Her team had been discussing plans to begin the extensive renovations to the building, and Nia had already laid out a vision that included not only restoring its historical beauty, but also implementing eco-friendly updates and creating affordable living spaces. It was a project that could benefit everyone in the neighborhood, from artists to young professionals. But there was something more she could add. A special initiative aimed at creating spaces for community outreach, giving local residents access to services like legal aid, housing assistance, and educational workshops. It would be a statement, one that highlighted what real progress looked like in a city that was constantly evolving. Once the plans were finalized, Nia made sure that the details of her initiative were well publicized. She wanted the press to notice, not just for the positive impact of the renovation, but for the quiet way she was making her mark on the city's development. It was her subtle way of showing Judge Hawkins and the world that she was more than capable. The next time he walked into that building, he would see something completely different, not just a space he had lived in, but a space that symbolized what could happen when someone truly took ownership of their environment. But she wasn't just hoping for him to see the changes. Nia wanted him to understand the role he had played in her journey, that he had underestimated her, that he had missed an opportunity to listen. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but the challenge now was to make sure that when Judge Hawkins saw her again, it wasn't just as the woman who had been fined, but as the woman who had the power to change the city, to change his perspective, and to change the course of her own future. The clock was ticking, and Nia was ready to set everything into motion. As the weeks passed, Nia's strategy began to take shape. The renovations on her historic building were moving ahead swiftly, and the press was buzzing about the innovative plans she had laid out for it. She had made it clear that this wasn't just another gentrification project. This was a transformative effort meant to uplift the community, create opportunities for those who had been pushed aside by rising property prices, and breathe new life into a building that was both a relic of the past and a promise for the future. But her eyes were still on Judge Hawkins, and her plan to confront him was quietly unfolding. Nia didn't want to rush it. She knew timing was crucial. She also understood that this wasn't about seeking revenge. It was about making a point. The moment she had discovered that Hawkins was one of her tenants, it became clear that the power had shifted. He had unknowingly tied himself to her in a way that few could imagine, and now it was time for him to confront that reality. The building, now known as the Roberts Loft, was gaining traction in the press. Journalists were impressed with Nia's commitment to blending history with modern amenities, as well as her focus on creating affordable spaces in a city that had become increasingly expensive for young people and artists. The local community was rallying behind the project, and even some of the city officials who had once been wary of her were now expressing their support. But the real breakthrough came one afternoon when Nia decided to invite Judge Hawkins to an exclusive event at the building's grand reopening. The event would showcase the newly renovated spaces and unveil her community outreach initiative, an effort that would provide resources for legal assistance, financial literacy, and career development for people from all walks of life, particularly those in underserved communities. It was the perfect opportunity for Hawkins to see firsthand the type of positive impact she was having on the city, and more specifically in his own building. She didn't send the invitation directly. Instead, she had it delivered through the management company that oversaw the building. She knew Hawkins would recognize the name, and she knew the invitation would pique his interest. Nia didn't expect him to immediately accept, but she hoped the curiosity would be enough to make him reconsider the assumptions he had made about her in the courtroom. Meanwhile, the building continued to take shape. The lofts were nearly completed, and the space designated for community programs was beginning to come to life. Nia spent long hours on site, overseeing the final touches. She was hands-on with every detail, from the color schemes to the murals that would decorate the walls of the common areas. She wanted the building to reflect the values she held dear: community, creativity, and opportunity for all. Then, a few days later, as Nia was reviewing the progress of the renovations, she received a phone call. It was the management company. Judge Hawkins had agreed to attend the reopening event. Nia's heart skipped a beat. She had known this moment would come, but the realization that it was now within her grasp gave her a surge of energy. This would be her opportunity to show him who she truly was, not just the woman he had dismissed, but the visionary behind the transformation of an entire building, an entire neighborhood. Nia took a deep breath, knowing that her plan was now in motion. The judge would walk through the doors of her building, and he would see firsthand what she had accomplished. It was a quiet, powerful statement, a chance to show him that the woman he had underestimated was now the one shaping the future. It would be a moment not just for her, but for anyone who had ever felt dismissed or ignored by a system that was all too quick to judge based on appearances. This was Nia's moment, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. The day of the grand reopening finally arrived, and Nia stood in front of the newly restored building, feeling a mix of pride and anticipation. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the historic structure, and the vibrant murals on the walls seemed to dance in the light. The building, which had once been forgotten and neglected, was now a beacon of transformation. It stood tall and proud, a testament to what could be accomplished when vision, hard work, and determination came together. Nia had meticulously planned every detail of the event, ensuring that everything, from the speeches to the tours, would reflect the mission behind the renovation, revitalizing the community while preserving the city's history. She had also made sure the press was there, eager to capture the story of this woman who had once been dismissed by the city's elite and now stood as a symbol of resilience and change. As guests began to arrive, Nia's eyes scanned the crowd. The event was buzzing with excitement, people networking, laughing, and admiring the work that had been done. Journalists, local leaders, artists, and even some of her tenants were there, eager to see what she had accomplished. And then, like a quiet storm, Judge Hawkins arrived. He walked into the building with an air of authority, his presence unmistakable. Nia watched from across the room as he greeted a few city officials. His face was as stern as ever, but there was a visible curiosity in his eyes. She had to admit, seeing him there, in her space, was both surreal and satisfying. It wasn't just that he had attended. It was that he had come to see the fruits of her labor, the very thing he had been dismissive of in that courtroom. Nia took a deep breath and made her way over to him. As she approached, the judge turned to her, his eyes widening just slightly. He had never expected to see her here, in this space, much less at the center of such an ambitious and successful project. There was an awkward moment of recognition, but Nia offered a firm, welcoming smile. "Judge Hawkins," she greeted, her voice calm but resolute. "I'm glad you could make it." He gave her a polite nod, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for the right words. "Ms. Roberts, I must admit, this is quite impressive," he said, a subtle hint of admiration in his tone that Nia had never heard before. "Thank you," she replied, her smile never faltering. "I'm glad you think so. This building has a history, but it's also part of the future now." The judge nodded, still taking in the grandeur of the restored space. "I can see that. It's remarkable what you've done here. You've certainly turned this place around." Nia's heart raced, but she maintained her composure. "It wasn't easy," she said, "but it was worth it. Just like the work I'm doing across the city, I want to make sure that every community has a chance to thrive, not just the ones with the biggest pockets." Judge Hawkins met her gaze, and for a moment, Nia could see a flicker of realization pass through his eyes. This was no longer the same woman who had stood in his courtroom, facing a fine. This was someone who had transformed a vision into reality, someone whose work spoke louder than any courtroom ruling. I think I owe you an apology," the judge said, his tone softer now, almost reluctant. "I didn't fully understand the scale of what you were trying to do. I assumed things about you, about your intentions. I was wrong." Nia nodded, taking his words in stride. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough. "We all make assumptions," she said, "but what matters is what we do after we realize we've made them." The two stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their past interactions settling between them. But it wasn't uncomfortable. On the contrary, it felt like the beginning of something new. The judge had seen firsthand the impact of Nia's work, the way she had not only revitalized a building, but also uplifted a community. His apology, though quiet, was a step in the right direction, an acknowledgement that his initial judgment of her had been wrong. As the evening progressed, Nia led Hawkins on a tour of the building, pointing out the details of the renovation and explaining the community programs she had set up in the space. It was clear he was impressed, perhaps even moved, by the effort and heart she had poured into every corner of the building. By the end of the night, Judge Hawkins had left with a new perspective, not just on Nia, but on the power of vision and determination. As he walked away, Nia couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of victory. It wasn't about the apology or the recognition. It was about showing him, and everyone else, that she was more than what they had assumed. She had built something that was bigger than herself, a place that stood as a symbol of change, of resilience, and of the quiet strength that often goes unnoticed until it demands to be seen.